there's a lot of news that's happening. So I've been asked by a lot of people to go through a study that was reported yesterday by the New York Times. So one of the main issues that has cropped up so often in American society these days is, of course, racism. Right? Racism this and racism that, and racial disparities are indicative of the horror of American life. Right? America's racism problem is what has generated income inequality between black folks and white folks. And there's this brand new study from the New York Times, complete with massive, beautiful graphics, all about how black people can't get ahead in America. Here was the headline from the New York Times yesterday. Okay, extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys. Yeah, it's a pretty shocking headline, right, for the New York Times, which usually ends around its headlines. Usually it says something like, data sometimes suggest black people have faced discrimination in certain areas, people say. Right, that's a normal New York Times headline. So this one's a hard-hitting headline. Extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys. Okay, so what exactly does the study show? And this is a pretty important study, and I think it's important to deconstruct the study so that we know what we're talking about when we talk about whether racism is responsible for some of the imbalances we see in American life. Now, this is not to imply that racism hasn't been a historic part of America. Of course it has. This is not to imply that there is not racism today. Of course there is. What this is to suggest is that this study, which is being really touted as the final data on racism in America, demonstrating that only racism is responsible for the difference in income outcome between black folks and white folks, that's not what the study says. So, according to the New York Times, young black men lag behind young white men, not because of behavioral differences, not because young black men commit more crimes than young white men on average, or because they have a lower educational background, or because they have single dads, but because of widespread American racism. Here is what the Times reports. Black boys raised in America, even in the wealthiest families and living in some of the most well-to-do neighborhoods, still earn less in adulthood than white boys with similar backgrounds, according to a sweeping new study that traced the lives of millions of children. White boys who grow up rich are likely to remain that way. Black boys raised at the top, however, are more likely to become poor than to stay wealthy in their own adult households. So what this study's main finding is that if a black kid, a young black boy, grows up in a rich household in Beverly Hills next to a rich white family in Beverly Hills with a young white boy, that the black boy is more likely to fall into poverty than the white boy, even though they start off in the same area and with the same two-parent family. And so this must obviously be due to racism, right? This is the New York Times' take on the study. According to the Times, quote, gaps persisted even when black and white boys grew up in families with the same income, similar family structure, similar education levels, and even similar levels of accumulated wealth. So they're removing all the factors that people would normally suggest contribute to disparities between black income and white income. They're saying even when a rich black kid grows up rich and black with two parents and goes to a good high school and all this stuff, they still have lower outcomes than white folks. And the IQ is not the problem, right? So there's some people who are racially suggestive, we shall say, who say that maybe this is because black folks have lower IQs on average than white folks. The data is not there to suggest that. The reason the data is not there to suggest that is because the income outcome, right, the outcome of income for black women is exactly the same as for white women who grow up rich. So the disparity only exists between young black men and young white men. It does not exist between young black women and young white women. So if you have a rich black girl who grows up next to a rich white girl, they basically are going to have exactly the same income as their life progresses. So as I acknowledge, right? The study openly acknowledges that the racism doesn't extend to black women. So first of all, this gives the lie to a lot of the intersectional nonsense you hear from the left. So the case for intersectionality is that everyone's experience is different and is predicated upon group differences. A black woman is both black and a woman. This means that she has two status symbols, right? Being a female means that she has somehow been victimized by American society, and being black means she's been victimized. That means a black woman has been more victimized than a black male. Now, this study suggests the opposite, actually. This study actually suggests that young black men do worse in American society than black women. So much for that intersectional point. But this finding that no income gap exists between black and white women raised in similar households should also make you wonder, is this really about racism? Is racism the dividing line? Because, again, black women happen to be black. So if black women have the same outcomes as white women when given the same circumstances, wouldn't that suggest that racism is not actually the central problem, right? Black women aren't not black just because they're treated well by the surrounding community, right? That's a foolish argument. The study itself says that black women earn slightly more than white women, conditional on parent income. There's little or no gap in wage rates or hours of work between black and white women. And black women also have a higher college attendance rate than white men, conditional on parental income rather. So immediately, this should give you some serious pause as to the headline that was espoused by the New York Times. Again, the New York Times headline here was extensive data shows punishing reach of racism for black boys. They're already attributing all of the difference between black boys and white boys to racism, even though that racism apparently just disappears with regard to black women, which is kind of weird. right, immediately should wonder, is racism really the dividing factor here? Or is it that black women and black men actually have different perspectives on decision-making processes in higher income households? Right? Is it possible that young black men and young black women are encouraged to pursue different activities even in higher income households with two parents? Right? The study also finds that income gaps between whites and Hispanics are converging and will disappear in very short order. Asian Americans actually earn more than whites raised at the same income level. So again, this should call into question, if America is such a deeply racist place, why is it only racist apparently against black boys? Right? Not against black women, not against Hispanics, not against Asians, just against black boys. And this should make you wonder. It's also worth noting that one of the chief arguments in favor of the notion that blacks suffer under a regime of white privilege, when they say that people like me can't speak on politics because we are a member of a white privileged class and the system was built for us, one of the arguments for white privilege is that black people suffer in the United States today because of a historic wealth gap. That because black people were subject to slavery and Jim Crow, they have less wealth in the families in which they grow up. Okay, well, there is that wealth gap, but the study demonstrates that family wealth is actually not an indicator of continued life success for black men. So even when black men are growing up with a tremendous amount of wealth, they're having poorer outcomes in terms of income than white men are. So that suggests that wealth is actually not the primary differentiating factor between the outcome of people's earning power. So this is the big question of the study. The big question of the study is, are black men failing in a way black women are not because of discrimination, or is it because of differences in behavior? So my suggestion is that it would have something to do with differences in behavior. And the study itself suggests this, right? This is not the stuff the New York Times wants to cover. It's all buried in the 100-page study that I read yesterday. For example, the study discusses criminal behavior among high-income young black men, but it doesn't actually investigate the possible causal link between criminal behavior and drop in income. So the study says that black men raised in the top 1% of income, right, people who are millionaires, were as likely to be incarcerated as white men raised in households earning about $36,000 a year. So is that the fault of white racism? That's an amazing statistic. That means that a black kid growing up in a millionaire household is as likely to go to prison as a white kid growing up in a household earning $36,000. Is that the result of racism, or is that the result of bad individual behavior? Is it really that the police are staking out Beverly Hills for young black men who live in that area and then just arresting them willy-nilly? Or is it possible that criminal rates among young black men, even in upper income areas, are higher than they are among young black women, for example? And it has nothing to do with race, right? It has to do instead with certain cultural inculcation, which I'll get to in just a second. In fact, the study itself recognizes that incarceration is not the result of surrounding racism, that those incarceration rates that are elevated for young black men in rich areas are not actually the result of surrounding racism. They say that the relationship between racism in a given area and incarceration rates, quote, is not statistically significant, meaning that young black men are not being arrested just because the cops are a bunch of racists in Beverly Hills. As a sidebar, and this is an important point, high black crime rates do have horrible externalities for innocent young black men. I want to talk about this in a little bit because here's the area where racism really sort of does play a role, because I don't think that racism is a completely irrelevant factor, but I don't think it's quite racism either. I think that it's a form of discrimination that Thomas Sowell talks about, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Other differences between young black men and young black women is that the study indicates that the impact of neighborhood on young black men matters. Young black men do best in neighborhoods with low levels of racism. The study actually, its measurements of racism are really suspect. They use the implicit assessment test, the implicit bias assessment test, which is not a good test, and high levels of fatherhood in the community at large. So young black boys do better when there are dads in the community. What's interesting is that the study suggests it's not even having black men in the home. It's not even about having a father in the home. It's about, are there high levels of black men in the community who can play the father figure role? So that's an interesting thing. More social fabric helps raise boys better, whether they are white or black. But these communities are pretty rare, right? Single motherhood does remain prevalent in the black community, and the study admits, quote, the fraction of low-income black fathers present is most predictive of smaller intergenerational gaps. So again, it's about single motherhood. It is not really about racism. Black boys who grow up in areas with high father presence are also significantly less likely to be incarcerated, which could explain part of the association with higher employment rates. Back to the study that the New York Times calls a damning indictment of American racism with regard to young black boys. What I have suggested is that the data from the study actually suggests that differentiations between the outcomes for rich young black men and young black women, for example, or young black men and young white men, has little to do with generalized American racism and a lot to do with personal choices that are being made in the black community, even in areas that are more wealthy, right? So the study tries to attribute to generalized racism a little bit this differentiation between young black men and young white men, even if they are both rich. Right? The study's take on racism is actually its weakest methodologically. It uses that implicit association test, as I suggested. This is the implicit bias test. If you've been in college, they've forced you to take an IAT. What that is that stupid test where you're supposed to click on words as black and white faces appear. And what it's supposed to show is that if you click on negative words, when a black face appears more quickly than you click on negative words when a white face appears, this is your supposed racism. The problem is that the implicit assessment test actually doesn't measure real-world racism, nor is it even duplicable. If you take the test twice, you can game the system. Right? So you can take the test once, and it'll come up as you're a racist. You take it again, and now you're not a racist anymore. So the test is not actually duplicable. It's not a good measurement. The study itself states that closing the gap between whites and blacks is largely driven by high rates of father presence among low-income blacks. And the study even dismisses, right? This is all the stuff the New York Times didn't report. Right? The New York Times headline is that America's racist and black boys are suffering. Here's what the New York Times didn't report. There's a direct quote from the study. Policies focused on improving the economic outcomes of a single generation, such as cash transfer programs or minimum wage increases, are less likely to have persistent effects unless they also affect intergenerational mobility. So in other words, the Democrats' favorite methods of closing this gap, they don't do anything. Not only that, forced integration in schools and housing won't do anything either. They would, quote, also likely leave much of the gap in place, since the gap persists even among low-income children raised on the same block. So all of the left's favorite policy prescriptions that would rise from that shocking headline from the New York Times, the study itself rejects. So what exactly is the difference? So what exactly is the difference between why young black men who are growing up rich with two-parent families and young white men growing up the same way have different outcomes? What would explain that? Well, one theory that was put forward by black anthropologist John Ogbu since the 1980s theorized that black children are often penalized socially for acting white. Okay, those aren't my words. Those are the words of Barack Obama. Here's what Barack Obama said in 2004, quote, "Children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth of the book is acting white." And in fact, repeated studies have shown that even in high-income areas, black students spend less time on studying than white students, particularly black males. Barack Obama reiterated this in 2014. He said, "There's an element of truth in the accusation that too many black parents denigrate education, where, okay, if boys are reading too much, then, well, why are you doing that? Or why are you speaking so properly?" Right? This was a serious question that was asked about Barack Obama in 2008 by people on the left. Is he black enough because he doesn't speak in Ebonics and because the president used to, the ex-president used to, had a very mellifluous speaking voice. And if you turned on the radio, you wouldn't know whether he was white or black and use particular dialects. Right? There's a lot of talk. Is he too white? Right? Is Clarence Thomas too white? Right? Are educated black people too white? This is a serious issue that there are a lot of people who have faced. Larry Elder has talked about this a lot. Thomas Sowell has talked about this. There is a cultural denigration in certain parts of the black community against education. By the way, this exists in certain parts of the white community as well. In Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance talks specifically about this in impoverished white communities in Appalachia, for example. Communities that value education and that promote education are more likely to have children who value education, promote education, and end up with better life outcomes. The reason that Asians outperform whites is because Chinese American culture and Korean American culture, to take a couple of examples, are heavily focused on education and achievement. This is also true of Jewish Americans who came to the United States dirt poor and tested below average on IQ tests before they acclimated and ended up becoming one of the wealthier subgroups in the United States. Black children spend significantly less time on homework than any other race of children. Asian children spend significantly more time on homework. Okay, that makes a difference. Harvard's Roland Fryer, another black scholar, formalized a particular peer effect, acting white, which potentially contributes to the ongoing puzzle of black underachievement. His suggestion is that you are socially ostracized if you spend too much time studying as a young black male. The New York Times doesn't go into any of that, of course. All they do is they say young black men do worse than young white men. That must be to some greater